I am Attila. I'm from the Central European University, where I do research, mostly focusing on sustainable cities. I do research in China, Singapore, Canada, and in Europe, so a bit everywhere. And I'm also working for the European Union as a consultant in systems innovation, working with businesses and startups and entrepreneurs. But today, I'm going to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals as a policy framework and how did they evolve and how does it relate to your interest field, hopefully. That being said, I will introduce the global environmental politics that led us to the Sustainable Development Goals. I will talk about some lessons from the previous goal-based development cycle. It was called the Millennium Development Goals, the previous 15 years. I will talk about the importance of setting goals as humanity and also the importance of measuring our progress. Afterwards, I will introduce the Sustainable Development Goals framework. Hopefully you had a look in your homework assignment, yes? Talk about money, financing the Sustainable Development Goals, good governance, and also the feasibility of achieving them. So this is going to be the topic of today's session. But first I wanted to show this image. This is from over 500-year-old. It's from Hieronymus Bosch. It's titled The Garden of Earthly Delights. And if you have a look, well, to me, this sort of tells the story of mankind. So if in the first image, what do you guys see? Any ideas? Yeah, it's the Garden of Eden, harmony and peace and everything nice, happiness, etc. The next panel, well, it starts becoming more chaotic, overpopulation, chaos. Things start to get messy, and in the Bible, this is the picture of humankind before the flood. So before the Great Flood. And in the next image, this is practically hell. So twisted, burnt, decayed landscape where things didn't go right. The paradise has not been achieved. Everything is sort of collapsed. And as a society, we are probably in this middle section now, depending on where you live. But lots of things indicate that problems are getting out of hand, and especially if you don't pay attention, if you have your eyes closed, then the flood comes. And I think it's quite an interesting lesson from this painting, because when we think about human development, these are the directions that we can head towards. And as I mentioned, a lot of things indicate that things are going badly. This is just a screenshot of the Guardian news website. Hurricanes are ripping the United States apart, a typhoon ripping East Asia apart, United Kingdom is in peril, the Middle East is in peril, food production unsustainable, and this is just one screenshot. And these kind of storms and floods and shock waves and droughts are becoming a new normal for the world. And of course, this was just anecdotal evidence, but if we look at the data, everything is pretty much skyrocketing. So population on the left, socioeconomic trends, population, consumption, tourism, GDP. But on the other hand, in the Earth system trends, it's pollution and temperature and forest loss and degradation of ecosystems. And we have indeed achieved remarkable things as species, but the question is whether is this sustainable? Can we keep on going up higher, or are there limits? And so a lot of smart people were thinking about this, of course, and I will introduce some of the things that they came up with. But if you look at trends, for example. I'm not sure if you have seen this before. Have you guys introduced this? It's from the European Environmental Agency. So we are talking about Europe here, not just globally. So the European Environmental Agency, and they are pretty smart guys, they basically looked at all sorts of trends. So in this column, it's the past 10 years when it comes to different environmental topics, such as ecological status of freshwater bodies, water quality, air pollution, biodiversity. The next column is the next 20 years. So where are we really headed in Europe? And this one is indicating whether are we on track, if it means it's green, so there are no greens here. Partially on track is yellow, and not on track is red. Generally, green means good, yellow means okay, red means pretty bad. So if you look at this summary table, it doesn't look very good, right? So other topics, they did a lot of assessments on water management, transport, etc. Some of these are a bit better, but generally the trends are pretty meh, I would say. More stuff. Anyway, this is the final summary. So if you look at the 20-year outlook, the trends, that doesn't look very green, does it? So even in Europe, where the environmental policy is quite advanced, we are facing some issues and challenges for sure. So, and the rest of the world, of course, is behind Europe in many sense when it comes to setting environmental targets and setting goals. So you probably are familiar with the planetary boundaries concept. I think the most important message here is that we are becoming a threat to ourselves. So the economic production is so large, and our, productivity in many ways is so high, and the number of people on the planet is so vast that the effect of all this is becoming a burden on Earth itself, and it's overwhelming. And for the first time in human history, and the first time in the planet's history, one species, us humans, are threatening the fundamental Earth system and Earth's own dynamics. And this image shows that the biggest problems are probably going to be with climate change, biodiversity loss, and all sorts of biogeochemical flows, such as the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle, mostly because of land use and agriculture. And generally speaking, the question is that could we achieve a good life for all humans? These are countries based on this scale of good life, the Human Development Index, and environmental impact. So this is the sweet spot. This is where we want to get. The good life within environmental limits. The good question of sustainable development is that can we fit social, environmental, and economic factors together? How do we make the world both prosperous and also environmentally sustainable? That's the fundamental question. And so I mentioned that a lot of smart people were thinking about this. So I just wanted to run through a couple of these milestones in the last 50 years of human history. Maybe you have heard of some of these. A lot of environmental thinkers associate The Silent Spring. It's a book with the start of the environmental movement. And the Club of Rome was founded in the 60s. They have done their own thinking and analysis. But the first big international conference on the human environment was in Stockholm in 1972, this one. Also, the Limits to Growth publication came in that modeled the world. And the United Nations established the Brundtland Commission and asked them to think of what should we do, what is sustainability, what is sustainable development. And they came up with a working definition that you probably all know, development that meets the needs of present generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So that's the working definition of sustainable development. This was established in 1987. And a couple of years later, we had the first Earth Summit in June 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. It was quite a historical happening. The heads of over, I think, 100 countries were there, and 180 countries basically adopted Agenda 21, which is a global development goal in some sense, but also the Convention on Climate Change was established, the Convention on Biodiversity was established. So it was quite a historical summit in Rio in 1992. Probably the next larger milestone in this regard was in Johannesburg, 10 years later, also called Rio Plus 10 in 2002, where they have basically accepted a declaration on sustainable development and a plan of implementation. Again, it was adopted by most of the countries, and it was focusing on poverty and the environment. And it built on Agenda 21, which was accepted 10 years before. And it had quite a big emphasis on partnerships. So how could we build a momentum, and how could we create good partnerships to achieve what we want to achieve? 10 years later, again in Rio de Janeiro, also called Rio Plus 20, we have realized that we are still not on course. So we had a 40-year run so far, dating back to the first conference in Stockholm in 1972. And we took stock and realized that basically on one side, most of the evidence that pointed out that there are big problems and economic development and social inclusion and environmental sustainability doesn't fit together is true. And it was getting worse. Second, they concluded that the major actions that we wanted to take in the first Earth Summit in 1992, did not succeed. So we have achieved many things, but overall, it's not a success story. And the question was in 2012 in Rio, that how should the world respond to this? Because certainly we are in trouble. And the world leaders said that we should not give up, definitely. And quoting from the final outcome document of the conference called the Future We Want to commit ourselves in reinvigorating the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development that they launched in 1992. And basically, they want to commit even further and bring together everybody, including businesses, NGOs, universities, to address these implementation problems. They also recognize that the development of goals would be important to focus action on sustainable development. Moreover, so they have set the scene for the Sustainable Development Goals. They recognize their importance, and they said that the goals should address and incorporate all three dimensions of sustainable development and their interconnections. They should be action-oriented, concise, easy to communicate, limited in number, very aspirational, and global in nature. So not only a couple of countries, but everybody should be involved in this. Technically, they wanted to address all priority areas that I have mentioned and the world considered to be important. And so this was the basis of developing the Sustainable Development Goals. But there was another trend, I would say, which I will jump back to, because previously, before the Sustainable Development Goals, there was another global call of action on poverty. So eradicating global poverty, which is still with us, and the challenges of extreme poverty are still there in large parts of the world, and a lot of countries are stuck in something called a poverty trap. So when a country is impoverished and can't even collect proper taxes, tax revenue, can't afford basic investments in infrastructure, electrification, health systems, education, or getting rid of diseases such as malaria, then they cannot raise their productivity enough that they would, that their economy would work on a self-sustaining basis and they could invest into their own country and own infrastructure. So how do you break free of this poverty trap? And this problem exists in many countries still today: Africa, South America, some parts of Southeast Asia are still stuck in poverty trap. So how do you break free? Well, basically you need to help invest in these countries into basic infrastructure and needs. And the United Nations has adopted goals around meeting these basic needs globally. The most important by far, we have noted, has been the Millennium Development Goals I mentioned in the year 2000, so 18 years ago. And the background is that we have seen targeted investments in these critical areas, as I mentioned: health, education, infrastructure, can help very poor countries or regions to get out of this poverty trap. And once it's free from this poverty, by the virtue of higher income and by the virtue of the savings and the tax revenue of higher income, they can, afford their own investments at some point. Basically similar to how Europe did after the Marshall Plan in Western Europe after the Second World War. So that was actually the inspiration for this Millennium Development Goals, and also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. It's kind of like the Charter of the United Nations, kind of a moving document. And anyway, I think I have a picture of it. Yeah, so this is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Yeah, 1948. But I think more importantly, so member states adopted the Millennium Declaration in 2000 and adopted the Millennium Development Goals. So that was the first set of global goals we had. And one outcome of this was in 2005, they wanted to seek actions. And they wanted to do something with the Millennium Development Goals. How a lot of smart people sit together and they were thinking of how to implement it and how to do something in a practical way. And this is how the Millennium Village project got started. Millennium Development Villages got started. So if you look on this map of Africa, it shows you where Millennium Development Villages are located. Each of these are basically these pilot villages where they have tested different methods of helping those places. And the colors indicate that Africa was basically split up with different kinds of agricultural practices and farm systems and social challenges such as malaria. And so the Millennium Development Village project identified 10 very poor places with the help of these local governments. And each of these places at that time were hunger hotspots. So where hunger was very strong, a large number of people were undernourished or starving. And the idea was to apply the Millennium Development Goals as a guiding principle, take a more holistic approach, look at all the problems that are there, and try to achieve all the 8 Millennium Development Goals. Apply them in practice, but not just the health project, not just an education project, but everything together, a whole package. And they spent about $120 per villager, which isn't that much money on agriculture, on their schooling, on bed nets to protect them from malaria. So all sorts of these smaller supporting infrastructure things in these villages. And it was a huge success. So it was a very successful development effort that took place. If you're interested, you can look up the case studies online. You can read about each of the villages. One of them became a potato and onion farm for the region. So it was very successful economic development happening in these places with the help of this global fund. And anyway, later on, this project was scaled up to 20 countries and helped a lot in achieving poverty reduction in the areas. So overall, what I wanted to share is some conclusions from the Millennium Development Goals. I have studied quite a few of the reports and the outcome documents. And so the question is, why do goals matter? Why should we set goals? And I think the answer has many different aspects to it. First, goals are really critical for social mobilization. So the world needs to be oriented in a direction to fight poverty or to help achieve sustainable development. But if we don't say these goals loudly for ourselves, that this is important, it's kind of hard in this noisy and crowded world to mobilize people in a direction unless it's very clear where we are going. So stating goals helps all over the world for individuals and companies and governments to say that, yes, we have agreed, this is a good direction, let's go there. So that's, I think, maybe the most important aspect. The second aspect is that the Millennium Development Goals showed that is peer pressure. So it means that when these Millennium Development Goals were adopted, governments, countries had to commit to them. And, and then there were these global summits where world leaders meet, for example, the United Nations General Assembly, where they had to report on their progress. People ask them, okay, so how are you doing with the Millennium Development Goals? You have received this amount of money, and so what's your progress? What steps have you taken? And, this kind of dynamic sort of peer pressure between countries who took part in it became an interesting political dynamic. It was absolutely real, according to reports and interviews that I have done with people who were involved. The third way that goals matter is mobilizing knowledge communities, networks of expertise, I would say. So practitioners around challenges such as growing food in an area, fighting diseases in an area, providing better education, etc., designing better cities, whatever you are interested in. And so when goals were set, it helped because these knowledge communities felt important. So by the virtue of having that goal, the community of experts in health or education or urban planning, so it brought together these knowledge communities. They were willing to help these host governments in achieving progress. And they felt important and they wanted to be involved. So this was quite interesting. And finally, goals do not only mobilize these knowledge communities, but they mobilize, what I would call is local stakeholder networks. And by that, I mean that, let's say, if you're fighting malaria in Ghana or Uganda or somewhere, you need to get around a table of stakeholders, I would say, community leaders, politicians, Ministry of Health, scientists, local academics, leading non-governmental organizations, maybe church groups, public health sector, international organizations, donors, foundations, so all actors that might have resources or knowledge or any sort of impact or mandate to help you achieve the goals. And so these key stakeholders need to be pulled together, and where it was done, then the implementation of the goals were kind of successful. So this kind of multi-stakeholder process is also essential for complex challenges such as achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. I believe a pretty good summary of this is from John F. Kennedy 50 years ago, actually while the Americans and the Soviet Union was negotiating a nuclear treaty. And so Kennedy said that by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, and here he was talking about peace between the Soviet Union and America. But so he said that we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and move irresistibly towards it. And what he meant is that, if you help people see these goals and make them more manageable and less remote, by spelling out how can they be achieved, people can be led towards it. That was the importance of goal setting for Kennedy. And in terms of lessons from the Millennium Development Goals, we have seen that probably the biggest accomplishment of them were in the area of public health. 3 out of 8 Millennium Development Goals are about health. So reducing child mortality, maternal mortality, and controlling diseases and epidemics. In all of these cases, the MDGs have made a pretty big difference. And the reason for that, in some areas, they were still lagging behind. So, for example, fighting for clean water and sanitation wasn't a successful achievement. It wasn't a successful work in these 15 years. But anyway, the lesson here is that we have to mobilize these local communities of stakeholders to achieve what we want to achieve. And some of the topics in the Sustainable Development Goals are much more complicated than these. Decarbonizing the energy system, transforming cities. So anyway, that's, I think, quite important to look at the previous goal-based cycle to know where we are headed. So now we have the Sustainable Development Goals. As I mentioned, it came up in 2012 in Rio. There was a big political commitment in Rio in 2012. They adopted the Future We Want document. You have seen the quotes from it. And basically, it led to the Open Working Group of the United Nations, and they have developed the Sustainable Development Goals 2013, which was adopted in New York in 2015. And since that, we have the Agenda for Sustainable Development 2030. And so this is when the SDGs were accepted by the global community. You probably had a look at these goals, but you can see them here anyway. So you had some kind of homework assignment, which Olga kindly introduced yesterday. So you have your own group assignments, right? And so by nodding, have you had a look at the Sustainable Development Goals as a homework to sort of try to connect it with your own assignments? Okay, you are nodding. I like you. So how many groups do we have here present? 5. So could we maybe take each group just 2 minutes? Maybe you could report back or tell me what kind of connections have you seen with the Sustainable Development Goals? So which goals were the most relevant for your work? Under each goal, there are a number of targets. I was wondering if you had a look at the targets and which one did you find most related to your work. So could we just take 2 minutes, 2 minutes each group on what did you find? Which group would like to start?
Number 1.
doesn't have to be an analysis, just how do you feel?
We decided that goal 14 and 15 are most important in our assignment, because we in our assignment we want to make special territory in our region where we protect
ecosystems
Okay.
near a lake
Okay.
and the forest.
Okay. Yeah, it seems relevant.
So life on water, ecosystem in the lake and life on land.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Another group? Doesn't have to be all the groups. Just wanted to get some thoughts from you.
Well, first, protect, restore and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainable manage forests, combat desertification,
Okay.
halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. Second, taking urgent action to combat climate change and its consequences. And third goal, promoting inclusive, safe, resilience and sustainable cities and human sustainability.
Okay. Thank you very much. So thanks, guys. So another thing I wanted to show is that this comes from a researcher who looked at all the Sustainable Development Goals, and each of the Sustainable Development Goals have targets under them, as you have seen, and so she tried to connect these targets with each other. So where do the Sustainable Development Goals overlap? And quite a lot of connections are there. So it shows that it's quite a comprehensive set of goals, and you can just pick two of them and ignore the rest because it's all connected and they are all quite interlinked. I just wanted to show this. I think it's a very nice visualization of this interconnection. The next topic I wanted to touch upon is related to money. So in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, you need a lot of investment. You need a lot of money. Like in anything, when you build for the future. So who's going to pay for the Sustainable Development Goals? A lot of people ask. In the end, we're all going to pay in some sense, because in our economy, the interaction between, economic actors, supply and demand is a good motivation for financing. So businesses build factories because they want to make profits from them. And we pay taxes so that the governments can provide public services, whether it's, roads or providing healthcare or education or police services or funding scientific research, which underpins technological change, and in many cases, so Sustainable Development Goals are going to be paid by all of us. And the free market philosophy says that let the markets do it. So it's a more maybe American approach, I would say. The government will just waste the money, lose it, or screw it up in some way, and so we shouldn't give them too much. But the advocates of public leadership say that the markets aren't taking on investments that might be necessary, such as clean energy. They don't build roads. They are not providing healthcare for the poor people. So we need also a public approach. And of course, the truth is that in some sense, we need different kinds of financing, both public and private. Sometimes public-private partnerships. These are becoming quite popular to achieve some common objectives. And generally, some things work really well through the private sector, other things do not. And at the core of our understanding of these issues, we have to set these boundaries right. And what are the most effective ways to allocate responsibility between the public and private sector, market-based or public-based financing? And one really successful market-based intervention globally, where markets have done brilliantly almost on its own, I think is a good example is the expansion of mobile technology in all parts of the world. So it's a great technological breakthrough, right? We all love our mobile phones. And it's in a very short period of time, roughly about 25 years, the number of mobile subscribers have increased from a few millions of people in the 90s, early 90s, to more than 6 billion subscribers today. So almost every person on the planet has a phone, including many of the world's poorest people. And this was not on the basis of a governmental program. This was on the basis of private mobile phone providers looking for profit, making investments in base stations and other aspects of connectivity like, I don't know, fiber optical lines and whatever. And then people buying the phones and buying access to connectivity because it was important to them in Africa and everywhere. So this is an example where the markets have done it. Even though, of course, the underlying technology that made it possible started with scientific research, quantum mechanics and engineering, but and most of that was funded by universities, so the public sector. And then the technological solutions was taken up by private actors and spread across the globe. But it's a good story. It's a positive story. It brought a connectivity across the globe and didn't need a lot of taxpayer money. Another story, however, is more of a failure. For example, bed nets. They protect people from mosquitoes in malaria regions of the world, Africa and Southeast Asia. And so when it comes to spreading bed nets, which are really important to stop malaria, the markets were not successful. So people didn't buy these bed nets, and these companies that were selling them realized that those who need it the most are not really buying and they are not customers. So this is where you need a government intervention. This is where you need some public financing. This is where you maybe need to give the bed nets to the people so that later on you don't have to treat them in the hospital. And in some countries, they don't have this kind of money to spread solutions like bed nets. And this is when, international help, international money can help achieving it. But so this is when, for example, the markets didn't work. And in many other cases, we will see, but in many cases, the private sector is going to be a natural way to finance development. Let's see, big power plants that will be built in most places will be built by private companies, but they need the right incentives to have those investments. You need some sort of corrective pricing, for example, a carbon tax, or sort of incentivize renewable energy instead of coal-fired power plants. And this is when, again, the public sector comes in. This is when we have to think of environmental economics, environmental policy, to incentivize the right kind of development. And well, overall, we certainly need an innovation in financing, and we need to think about these issues. So this is why I also wanted to talk a little bit about good governance, because I like to consider sustainable development as having four major dimensions. So there is the traditional three, which is social inclusion, environmental sustainability, and economic development, the classic 3 pillars. But those 3 require, all of them, an underpinning of a 4th aspect, which is good governance. And so I would like to put good governance under them as a total package in order to achieve an actual sustainable development and achieve the sustainable development goals. Because good governance is going to play an important role in achieving or failing to achieve the sustainable development goals. So I think it's important to think clearly what do we mean about a good governance. And here I would like to speak both about public and private sector governance. So I'm talking about organizations, and it could be a ministry, it could be a corporate, it could be an international, multinational company. So it means good corporate governance. But I'm also talking about public sector, so national governments or municipalities. And overall, it's clear that there are many, many kinds of governments across the world, many different rules, different constitutional principles, different histories, and it wouldn't be smart to believe that there is only one set of political rule, for example, that will dictate what's the best way to achieve the sustainable development goals. So the world's governments are not going to have it that way. It's not even correct to think that there's only one way of good governance. There's going to be no magical formulae, you must have elections and you must have a parliament and you must have prime minister or whatever. But what can work, I believe, is to emphasize a certain set of principles or behavior for the public sector and the private sector as well that we have noticed to be good directions. So the first is accountability. So governments and businesses need to be accountable for their actions. Businesses are in part accountable to markets, so people don't buy their products if they don't like them. They are also accountable to law, environmental laws, for example, if they don't try to dodge it and sneak their way out. And of course, public governments are accountable to their citizens, for example, through democratic elections. But governments don't need to be, democratically elected in order to be accountable. I did a lot of work in China where they are trying to be as transparent and as clear about their goals as possible, even though they are not democratically elected. So by accountability, we would like governments to adopt goals, set goals, and be responsible for implementing them and following through and reporting on them and being clear about the measures and the actions they want to take to achieve those goals. And we also want some sort of public assessments of progress or failure or progress, assessments of progress towards the goals they set in all sorts of political systems. So that's almost the second principle. Oops, sorry, I didn't jump here. The second principle is transparency. So we as citizens and as market participants, as human beings, voters, are also part of this story and in achieving sustainable development because we can hold governments accountable for their actions in the topics that we find important. So, but first we have to know what those actions are, and we have to. This is exactly why you have to fight institutional secrecy, tax havens where multinational companies funnel monies through to avoid taxation or hide their behavior, for example, using local laws to dodge or do unjust business. You probably heard about all sorts of practices of child labor, etc. So you will have to demand transparency because these actions have a huge impact on the success or failure globally on the objectives that we have, for example, in ending extreme poverty. So yeah, transparency is important. Third is participation. So the ability to be participatory. So the ability of citizens and stakeholders to participate in decision making. And of course, there are many views on how to do it, how to participate. For example, elections are kind of participation, but that's not the only kind. You know, there are public discussions, debates, hearings are all important, and the businesses could also be confronted. So some businesses in Europe have taken real good multi-stakeholder approaches. And for example, in Germany, the workers in larger companies, they also have a formal, legalized right to participate in corporate decision making, to participate in the company's decisions. And not only the shareholders, so the owners of the company, but also the workers. I think it's quite an interesting approach. Number 4 is more environmental oriented. Probably you have heard of this, the polluter pays principle. Basically, everybody needs to clean up after ourselves. So if we are imposing a cost on something, when we pollute waterways, when we pollute the air, when a company does that, it should be incorporated in the product price because it has a social cost. So, but also as individuals or businesses, when you put carbon dioxide in the air, you have to internalize those costs, internalize the externality, and economists would say. It means that we have to reflect on the full social cost of actions in our decision making. Sometimes it doesn't appear in the actual price, but maybe it should. So, you know, consider a business that operates in a poor country, and the poor country has a very weak environmental standards, so you can pollute all the way you want. Is it a right of the business to do that, even if it's not against the law? Is it okay to pollute a village because it's not directly conflicting with the law? Or is it the responsibility of the business to not do that just because they can? Anyway, it's again a question of morals and responsibility. And closely related to this is an ancient, quite important doctrine from Latin, known as primum non nocere, means first to do no harm, or in other words, do not do to others what you would not have them do to you. I think it's sort of a golden rule in underpinning many great religions as well. But it's also a measure of equality and fairness and of mutual responsibility, I would say. And it can also be an underpinning of a more global ethical effort that makes it possible for the world to take the ideas of sustainable development and turn them into practice. Talking about the companies, don't try to find every loophole or every escape valve that would allow you to pollute or destroy things to maximize profit just because you can. It's pretty simple. And lastly, I would say that finally, so I would say that good governance when it comes to sustainable development requires commitment to this. So national governments have a responsibility to commit to planetary problems and needs. It's not good enough in an interconnected world to say that, I was locally elected and it's not my responsibility to act on global issues which may benefit another country. I'm only responsible to my own people. We need a more universal commitment when it comes to implementing these sustainable development goals. And also it's important for companies to, sort of find their responsible role and their position in the world system, and how could they contribute. and part of this story will be, connected to. I mean, overall, I think if these basic principles of accountability, transparency, the polluter pays principle, participation, are in some form met. It doesn't have to be these words, and it doesn't have to be this harsh, but these are the directions that are generally perceived to work well when it comes to good governance. And if we could implement these in an approximate form, then we can make an important headway of governments working far more effectively together, and also, as I said, businesses playing, a more responsible role in this story. So this is about good governance. And I mentioned accountability and transparency, and that usually requires measuring progress. So that requires good indicators. And I'm asking again, are we going to have another sort of 20, 30 minutes so that I can talk about indicators? Okay, good. First, any questions so far? Any concerns, questions? We can ask, talk afterwards as well. Then I will finish and then we can talk. So, what is an indicator? This is an indicator. You're probably familiar with it. This is a more complicated indicator, contains more information. This is an even more complicated indicator, contains even more information. And so indicators, by definition, are sort of reflections of reality that we can measure and based on uncertain and imperfect models. So it's a sort of a model of something. And one of the best publications on this is from Donella Meadows. She was also a co-author in the Limits to Growth. I highly recommend you guys to read it, because she says if we don't use metrics, if we don't measure something, then we might go off course. We might not even head the right direction. And indicators are powerful because we set them. We can measure what we want to measure. So discovering this is also an important process. It's sort of empowering to learn where we want to go. Sometimes it's a question of values. What do we really care about? For example, GDP, I will maybe talk a little bit about GDP, can be criticized for being a somewhat misleading measure when it comes to development. And so indicators come in many forms or shapes. It can be maps, it can be charts, it can be graphs, but they should be relatively simple because they indicate some sort of underlying complexity. So they sit on top of complex things, but they communicate it very clearly. And I think that's their role. That's a good indicator, in my opinion. So indicators should be relevant, credible, like scientifically backed by data, should be understandable. So you should be able to easily interpret what it means. It should be measurable, means you need to have the data. And for example, this is where measuring progress in the Sustainable Development Goals is quite difficult, because if you looked at the targets, each of them have an indicator. I will show a picture of that. And it's not easy to find good data to track those targets and to track those indicators, because it just doesn't exist. For example, you mentioned those two goals on life in water and life on earth, life on land. And those are particularly hard to track because biodiversity is very hard to track. It needs a lot of effort. And so for this reason, it's a difficult one. But anyway, so indicators should also be, I would say explicit in a way. It should inform us, are we in the right direction? Where do we even want to be? For example, I like polar bears, but how many polar bears there should be it's very hard to set sometimes. Sometimes it's not easy to say. But in many other areas, like, carbon dioxide concentration in the air, we know that we shouldn't go beyond a certain limit. We know that more is not good. Aggregability is a good question. Should we be able to put a lot of indicators together and come up with an aggregate number about something? For example, we'll discuss this in the next minutes, but the Human Development Index is an aggregate indicator. So it includes GDP, income, it includes education levels like years of schooling, and it includes life expectancy. So you can put these three information together and create a more complex indicator that can measure progress in a bit better way than just the economical story. So, but in some cases, maybe it's not worth it to aggregate, because it's very hard to come up with one universal indicator for complex issues such as sustainable development. In my work at CU, we are working on something called the Urban Nature Index, where we are trying to assess the benefits of urban nature, like a public park or a waterway. What kind of services does it deliver? It delivers mental health, positive mental health to people. It delivers, reduces the urban heat island. It increases biodiversity, etc. So there are many positive things that urban nature brings to us, but they are quite hard to measure. And we're working on an urban nature index that tries to compile 100 different indicators into one number or three numbers, and so that we could measure which development is better for us as humans. But again, it's a very complicated indicator exercise. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about the problems of measuring progress, because we have to measure economic performance, level of welfare, and the state of the environment. And how do we usually measure progress? We just use the GDP. That's a bit of a conflict topic, I think. This is how the world looks if you look at it through the lens of GDP. The darker blue means higher GDP. It usually means more well-being, quality of life, life expectancy, education. What's not included in the GDP is, for example, the quality of the environment and the changes in the stock of natural resources. Moreover, it's also not included the services, ecosystem services provided by the environment. For example, all sorts of sink functions, improvements in quality of life, etc. These don't have a market value, so they are not included. And what's incorrectly in GDP is all sorts of expenditures, for example, to restore a degraded lake. The lake has been polluted by a company. To restore it, you need efforts, and that will increase the GDP, but it's not really going to make anybody happier. Or there has been a huge hurricane and there are big damages in the city. Restoring it will increase the GDP, but it's again not good for anybody. And nobody is really happier than we were before, although the GDP is rising. So these are some problems of GDP. And so many people were thinking of reforming GDP as an indicator. How could we incorporate welfare and environment in it? And of course, it's not easy. One attempt to maybe create a more refined indicator is I've introduced the Human Development Index. Again, it includes life expectancy, so sort of health issues, and also it includes an educational index, which means the amount of years spent in school per person, and it puts together it with the GDP, so level of income. And it creates a more complicated indicator, and also it changes how the world looks a little bit. What's, I think, quite interesting is to look at countries that are doing much better in GDP per capita than in HDI the Human Development Index. For example, a lot of Arab countries, Arab states are really high in GDP per capita, but they are quite terrible in Human Development Index, human development. Also, lots of African countries that have maybe rich oil or diamond deposits, and so they have lots of mining industry, but only a few people get really rich. Most of the population is quite poor, and this money is not invested in the education and the health system. So usually these countries are doing much better in GDP. You know, look at Oman, they are 30 in terms of GDP per capita in the list of countries. They take the 30th position, but in HDI they are 146. So big differences. Equatorial Guinea, very similar. Lots of other African countries. South Africa is included. United Arab Emirates, they are 6th per GDP per capita and 41 in HDI. So big differences. On the other way around, there are countries that have pretty low GDP per capita, fairly underdeveloped economies, but still good health and educational and other social systems. For example, Pakistan is actually the first one. They have, in GDP per capita, they are 143, but their HDI is 52. So they are doing much better than what you would expect based on their economy. So life is not as bad there as it would, as the GDP would indicate. Actually, lots of post-Soviet countries are also in a similar situation. Belarus is, I think, 6th. So they are doing, much better. Russia also, Hungary. So lots of post-Soviet countries. Interestingly, for example, South Korea is also here. So their GDP per capita is 33, but their HDI is number 12. So they are investing a lot of this economic development into education and health systems, which means that life quality is higher there. So, this is not such a complicated indicator, the Human Development Index, but it already shows a more refined picture of a country. It's more closer to reality when we talk about human development and well-being. Another interesting effort to measure development, I think it's kind of fascinating, is to assess happiness in a fairly straightforward way. So ask people, are you happy? Did you have a good day yesterday? How do you evaluate your life? Are you satisfied with your life? And then put it on a map, how happy people are. The darker means high happiness, and the lighter means low happiness, based on their answers. And there are, lots of middle-income countries that are actually quite happy, close to the top of this happiness chart. But of course, it's richer countries tend to be on top. Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, they have very high ranking. I think Denmark is number 1. So we have to realize that income is just one aspect of happiness. There are many countries that aren't doing well in terms of GDP, but they are pretty good in terms of happiness. For example, South America is a good example of that. And so researchers looked into this, like how could this be possible that you have a terrible economy, but you still feel happy? And I've read a couple of publications on this, and one major reason for happiness or unhappiness is what I would researchers call social capital, social connections. So, do people have a good network of friends and colleagues? Do they trust their community? Do they trust their friends? Do they trust their government? That's a huge determinant of whether people report their lives to be of high satisfaction or not. So connections and communities. Health, physical health, and mental health, of course, plays a very important role. But what I would like to reflect on is what I find fascinating is that individuals' values, so the values that individuals hold who answer this question seem to be really strongly linked to their happiness. So interestingly, people who report a very strong fixation on, getting rich, being very materialistic, I want money, I want to be rich, I want high career, turn out to be more frustrated and less happy. And they don't report as much satisfaction in life. People who report that generosity is very important to them, volunteering, giving, contributing to their community, in many studies were connected to higher levels of happiness. So people who hold these values of volunteering and giving tend to be much more happy. They report happiness much more often. And I think it's quite important for us to think about this when we talk about sustainable development, because this is to some extent the goal. So if we just simply chase, GDP and richness and income per capita, that maybe we are going to lose in many accounts. But if we promote values of generosity and volunteerism rather than strong materialism and richness, then So if you're just trying to get rich, then people become less happy. That's an interesting conclusion from this line of research, and this is why I think the happiness index is quite an interesting indicator. Actually, Singapore and China was thinking of using it as some sort of governmental policy to follow the happiness indicator as a guiding compass for setting up public policy, but then it was about 20 years ago, but then they abandoned the idea because it was too complicated. But Bhutan did it. Maybe, the country of Bhutan, they have happiness indicator as an important development indicator. And there are many more. I don't want to talk about most of these. How could you adjust GDP in a way that it's a more refined indicator? For example, the genuine progress indicator, basically it adds things like voluntary work to GDP, household work, raising children, etc. is a plus. It's a good thing, it contributes. But the cost of criminality, the cost of commuting to work every day, you spend 1 hour on the bus or in the car, water pollution, all sorts of pollution. So these are damages, these are negatives. So they are trying to adjust GDP with these indicators of pluses and minuses. And interestingly, if you apply this in countries, I think this is actually something like Germany or something. Interestingly, what you see is that the GDP per capita, the red one, is rising. But this genuine progress indicator, which includes all sorts of other aspects of life, is actually quite stable. So, even though GDP is going up, people's general perception of wealth remains almost the same. So I think it's also quite interesting to think about it. Okay, and so when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals, if you looked at the website, you can see that there are targets and indicators for each of the Sustainable Development Goals. So you can also check out those indicators, and if you use them, you can easily use them in your work. So the SDGs are fairly easy to communicate. It is underpinning public policy in many countries now. So if you talk to people who work in public policy and you are knowledgeable about the Sustainable Development Goals, maybe you can convince them easier about different issues. So it's a pretty interesting tool to use for you guys as sort of people who would like to change things for the better. This is why I think it's important to know about it, and it's also kind of important that you know how it's measured and what are the targets. A couple of weeks ago, we had a lecture at Central European University, Laszlo Borbély, who is the head of the Sustainable Development Office in Romania. And he introduced their plans on using the Sustainable Development Goals as a national framework in Romania. And he did a remarkable job at this. He has been involved in, as an academic professor and as a public policy person, he was involved in this work for decades, so almost 30 years. So he was on the front line when the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. He was already an important person in the Romanian government. So as soon as the SDGs were adopted, he and some of his colleagues came up with a plan on how to turn it into reality in Romania. So they basically came forward with a proposal that was adopted by the parliament of Romania. Almost everybody voted yes on a joint statement to support this 2030 SDG agenda. They were the first European country, almost the first country in the world that did this, and which is, quite interesting. Romania, who would think that they are going to be leading the way? And they took a multi-level approach. So they basically structured the government in a way that at each level, down to the municipal level, there would be people responsible for implementation, but also all sorts of stakeholders would be involved, including academic sphere and private sectors, NGOs. So they started to build up the structure and some momentum with this multi-level stakeholder-based approach. And they came up with Romania's Sustainable Development Strategy, which I'm not going to introduce now, but you can, look it up because there are good English summaries available. And they basically structured it around the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And, one interesting thing, for example, is that they have a committee on sustainable development that is chaired and headed by the prime minister. So the highest level person in the government has to go to these meetings and, coordinate the discussion every year 4 times. So the prime minister hears about sustainable development work because he has to chair the meeting very, very often. And this has an impact on governmental policy because at least the prime minister knows about these issues and knows how things are going. So, it's quite interesting development. I think they did a pretty good job at putting SDGs into the government and into public policy. Okay. One interesting thing maybe is that Romania is going to be in the EU presidency in next year, and they might use the Sustainable Development Goals as their sort of topic that they want to push in the European Union in the next year. So maybe it's going to be even more important. Okay, so a good question is, could we carry out the Sustainable Development Goals in time? A good question, is it feasible? Is the SDG framework feasible? Can we do this? I wonder what you guys think, maybe. Of course, okay, very optimistic. Well, because so a lot of people were thinking, yeah, go ahead. Some of it.
They will be quite hard, but those ones that are about health and education, I think it's quite easy.
So there are differences between them. Yep. Any other thoughts? For example, what I find a bit weird is one of the goals is economic development. That's a bit contradictory, and some goals are much harder. Certainly, like climate action, water, life on land. So these are very difficult ones. And as you said, some are maybe more straightforward. Education, health could be more straightforward. But so a lot of smart people were, thinking about it. And many of them, I have read a couple of books from really good thinkers. And so for very smart people, it's a very deep and real concern that we are not going to make it. So the world is going the wrong way. Climate change is happening. The 6th great extinction is happening. Cities are in danger. Food supplies are in danger. Refugees everywhere. widening inequalities, etc. So maybe things are not going so well. And for example, 3 authors who I really admire have expressed serious doubts, like Jane Jacobs, one of the world's greatest urbanists, champion of vibrant, sustainable urban areas. In her last years of life, unfortunately, she passed away. She wrote a book called Dark Age Ahead. It's a very troubling book to read from a wonderful thinker who argued that, we are not making it right now. We are on a wrong track. And this could rival the pessimism of Sir Martin Rees. Our final hour, will humanity survive the 21st century? Horror, terror. So it's also quite a pessimistic book. You can tell it by the title. And another great ecologist, the pioneer of interconnectedness in global ecosystems, James Lovelock, the inventor of the Gaia theory, a fantastic ecologist, system scientist in the 70s. So he recently wrote a book called The Revenge of Gaia, where he basically declared that we have lost it, we passed the planetary boundaries so much that, many parts of the world are just going to be doomed, and so many problems. And so some people are quite pessimistic, and it's certainly, I think it's a true statement, and I didn't say this, but simply speaking, sustainable development is probably the greatest challenge and the most complicated public policy challenge that humanity has ever faced. And we found ourselves in this situation just too fast and totally unequipped to deal with lots of these issues. And now we don't have a lot of space to do it because we screwed up the last 20, 30 years just talking about it. Although, we made big progress in many sense, but certainly we need a bit more, and we need the implementation to step up to the challenge. And so as sort of inspiration, I think the most important message is that ideas count a lot, so they matter and they have an effect on public policy far beyond anything that can be imagined. So throughout history, ideas have been really transformative despite, vested interests and stronger opposing forces. The end of slavery, which was a massive social movement, the peaceful struggle led against the colonial rule led by Gandhi and elsewhere, civil rights movement by Martin Luther King, the human rights movement followed on. It's the basis of the Moral Charter of the United Nations I mentioned earlier. It expanded the reach of human rights globally, and it basically established the ground for the Millennium Development Goals, which then turned into the Sustainable Development Goals. So again, ideas played quite an enormous role, and that brings us to the ideas of our time, technically. I think sustainable development is a way of solving problems. These could be small problems, large problems, but they certainly need to be solved. And we shouldn't be pessimistic or skeptic about it, because there's lots of reasons to point out difficulties, but we have to also look beyond them and look forward to what needs to be done to find the right kind of pathways and the next steps. And we also need people like you guys, who are going to be experts in something, and you can contribute with your expertise to this topic, but you also have to understand where you can contribute the most. Archimedes, in explaining the principles of the liver, said that to have declared to his friends that give me a place where I can stand and I shall move the world. So what I would like to suggest to you guys is to find your own topics and your interest field and your expertise, where you can contribute the most and where you can find your own leverage. And this was the message I wanted to sort of leave you with. Thanks for paying attention. And again, if you have any questions, we can discuss it in the break or in the next days or whatever.